The F1 Fiesta rolls on, and we took a quick high-altitude stop in Mexico City. It was a day of medium tyres, a day of hard tyres. Definitely not a day of soft tyres, but all in all an entertaining race that fizzled out exactly 7 laps before the end, when Hamilton pulled a rabbit and a second wind on his hard tyres out of the hat. Next week is Austin, where Lewis can become a 6-time world champion, which leaves us with one question. What the hell did Carlos Sainz do in that race? Hello and welcome to the TF1 Show's recap of the Mexican Grand Prix. I'm your host, Tines Ferreira, the hard tyre that keeps your car in the lead despite the high altitude graining that is the world of F1. So all in all, I feel that this Mexican Grand Prix was a bit like a souffle, really rising to become a masterpiece after lots of care, lots of nurturing and, precision ingredients and precision makeup and cooking, but then falling flat right at the point where Charles Leclerc overcooked it on his brakes into turn 4. But let's recap what was a race weekend with a couple of interesting talking points, and I guess as always the best place to start is with the victors, which were Mercedes again for the umpteenth time this season, which is I think a bit of a surprise given that we all thought that it was going to be a difficult weekend. Most especially Mercedes thought that it was going to be a difficult weekend for them, despite the fact that I think we can all agree they are a bit of a negative Nelly when it comes to predicting their performance over a weekend, with Toto Wolff and Lewis Hamilton always loving to downplay their chances, even though we all know they're probably going to end up doing a very good job regardless of where they are where they are racing. But I do think that they did have very specific difficulties this week, which were amplified because of the nature of racing at high altitude in Mexico, which is the highest altitude of the season when you measure it against where they typically race, which obviously brings a whole host of issues with that. And I thought I'd quickly just give a rundown of some of the interesting challenges that the engineers and the mechanics of these cars face when having to all of a sudden shift to a high altitude race weekend. So obviously high altitude means less air effectively available to cool the car down, push the car into the ground through downforce, keep the brakes cool, keep the turbo going. So it's a multifaceted problem that these teams have to solve, which I guess starts with the fact that the teams have much less downforce capability than what they typically would have otherwise. And it's interesting that the teams effectively come with their highest downforce setting on their car, so Singapore or Hungary level downforce on their cars, but actually get the physical amount of downforce that they would get driving in a track like Monza, where they effectively have a barn door as a rear wing. So that is an interesting one just to see, and I think that was Mercedes' first problem, given that they were up to this point this season gaining most of their time versus the rest through downforce, which is obviously diluted now during the Mexican Grand Prix, given that it's much more downforce limited or less downforce limited than what a race usually would be. And then secondly, Mercedes' engine has a bit of an issue with the less amount or the smaller amounts of air available to feed into the turbo and to cool all of its components down, something that they've always struggled with. And I think it has to do with the fact that they actually run a bigger turbo than some of the other teams, which means that the turbo is more is affected to a larger extent than what some of the other teams are. But I stand to be corrected with that. But I think we can all agree that Mercedes has a certain amount of challenges to deal with in Mexico, which I think also, given the fact that through practice and qualifying they look to be the third fastest team, they were going to be very happy with the result that they ended up getting, with Hamilton winning the race and Bottas coming in third, especially given Bottas's accident yesterday in qualifying, where it was actually quite a big accident. It didn't look to be that severe, but when you heard how out of breath he was over the radio immediately after and watching replays of it, he took a very big hit with that sort of barrier jutting out from the sidewall. So I think Bottas ending up on the podium, having his whole car rebuilt without incurring any sort of grid penalty, and I think kudos to the Mercedes team there for that as well. Bottas actually can feel very pleased with his performance overall. So I think Hamilton and Bottas were both really impressive in the race, but in two completely different ways, with Hamilton really making the strategy work for him, with keeping the tyres going despite all his protestations throughout the race, when it's becoming a bit of a trend now where his team will do something with strategy and then he'll spend the first 20 laps of the strategy just complaining about him not agreeing and him not thinking it's going to work, and then more often than not it actually does end up working out in the way that the engineers envisioned. But I think from a driving performance, it was another very impressive performance from Hamilton in terms of maintaining his tyres, maintaining good speed at the end, and especially given we all saw at the end that he actually had quite a big bit of his floor missing after his dalliances with Max Verstappen at the beginning of the race. It's a very impressive performance, and again highlights what an all-round driver he has now become, where he can be the fastest driver as well as the most conservative on his tires when the need arises. So a world champion's drive from Hamilton, I'd say, other than the fact that he got a bit whiny over the radio, which I found a bit unnecessary. Now, okay, so that's Hamilton, and when you think about Bottas, he did a very good job just in terms of pure race pace. I think this is one of his best races up for this entire season, in terms of him being able to keep up with the race leaders, him putting in consistent lap times throughout the race, him maintaining his impressive speed throughout the race. I think he probably had the best overall stint on the hard tyres. He kept Vettel very worried and honest, especially during the last 15 laps or so. And I think he does get a bit of a contributionary award for allowing Hamilton to win the race, because I think he kept Vettel adequately distracted to prevent him from probably going after Hamilton maybe at the later stages. So good job, Valtteri Bottas, and I think it's encouraging for him going into the next year's championship, because obviously Hamilton's championship is now all but sewn up. I think he needs 4 points in Austin. Doesn't matter what Bottas does. Bottas can win with fastest lap. If Hamilton scores 4 points, then he wins the world championship, which obviously will be an out of this world achievement for Hamilton, and thoroughly deserved for him and for the Mercedes team. But I think Bottas's performances last week in Japan and now again in Mexico does show that they will probably still be a team and a driver lineup to be reckoned with come next year, which I think will be encouraging for Mercedes. Alrighty, let's talk about Ferrari, who looked to be the team to beat right up until Max Verstappen stole their thunder in qualifying. Now, I was quite perplexed initially as to how it turned out to be like that. So it's obviously a mixture of Red Bull maybe hiding a bit of their true pace, or Red Bull's true pace being disguised by all sorts of things happening in practice that prevented them from really setting representative lap times on their runs. But I also heard that Ferrari decided over the evening between the Friday and the Saturday to increase the downforce levels of their car slightly, and to then obviously increase their drag of their car, which slightly decreased their top speed advantage. Now they felt that was the best compromise overall in terms of looking at the entire race weekend and their race performance, which I think maybe inhibited them slightly or decreased their advantage that they typically have on the Saturday in qualifying with their engine. But I still expected them to to at least be on pole position. It turned out to be like that, but obviously because of extraneous or external circumstances. But I think Ferrari they're going to be disappointed with their race results. Starting from first and second on the grid, ending up second and fourth, not what they would have wanted, I think. But some very interesting narratives, I think, coming out of the Ferrari camp still in Mexico, with the most pertinent, or at least in my opinion, the most pertinent being that Vettel now seems to have gotten on top of this Ferrari, and he does seem to be a bit more comfortable with getting a bit more out of the package and pushing harder, especially over one lap now when measured against Charles Leclerc, where especially I think from about the French Grand Prix up until Monza, Leclerc seemed to have the measure of that Ferrari and seemed to be able to get a lot more out of the car than Sebastian was able to. And it's been well documented on this podcast through various episodes that I was very concerned for Vettel's pace and Vettel's well-being within the team. But I think that Singapore upgrade has now allowed him to find a better balance in that Ferrari and to actually now put himself back on par with Leclerc, if not faster or ahead of Leclerc. Because I think over the whole weekend in Mexico, Vettel was probably the faster Ferrari driver. He looked more comfortable in practice. I think he would have had the fastest qualifying time in if it wasn't for Verstappen's or for Bottas's accident at the latter stages. I think Vettel was on par or on course to overtake Leclerc's qualifying time. So I think that's very encouraging for Sebastian Vettel and for Ferrari. How encouraging it is for the harmony within the team remains to be seen. I think they're probably just going to race hard for the remainder of the season now that there's nothing really on the line. But early next year, and especially mid next year, I think if Ferrari can give them a car to fight for the championship, it's going to get heated. I'm pretty sure of it, and I'm very much looking forward to see it. Let's quickly talk about how Ferrari's race panned out. So I think they got a bit caught out with strategy on both Leclerc's side and on Vettel's side of the garage. Obviously, they reacted to Albon coming in for an early pit stop with Leclerc, thinking that Albon would potentially undercut Charles if he gets a clear run or if he gets a good 1 or 2 laps in. It didn't turn out to be the case, with Albon then coming out into traffic and then not, losing a whole bunch of time to Leclerc. But then by putting Leclerc on the mediums again after that first pit stop, they effectively relegated him to a 2-stop strategy, which, as it panned out, turned to be the wrong choice. And Leclerc was always going to be up against it, having to overtake Bottas, Vettel and Hamilton at the end. And it didn't turn out to be possible given how well the hard tyres held up. Now with Vettel, Ferrari got a bit caught out with Hamilton. Obviously they got caught out with the hard tyres as well. But Mercedes pitted Hamilton, I think, quite unexpectedly from their perspective, which then meant that Ferrari was forced to go along with Vettel to try and get some sort of a tyre offset. I thought Vettel did actually quite well on that stint of mediums. He made them last quite long, and for a long period of time in halfway through the race, I was convinced that Vettel was going to win the race, given that Hamilton wasn't really gaining on Vettel during that stint, even though he was on faster tyres. But I think Hamilton was being a wily old fox and making sure that he had enough life at the end to ensure that Vettel couldn't get past. But I think in terms of strategy, Vettel definitely was outfoxed by Mercedes, and I think Leclerc was sort of definitely handed the short end of the stick with strategy as well. Although he did make a couple of mistakes that maybe hampered him a bit more than he should have. I think he had a couple of moments into turn 4 where he locked his tyres, losing a bunch of time, especially that at the end when he was chasing Bottas. Not an ideal situation for him to be making mistakes in a high stakes environment like that, but he is still young and he'll probably learn and iron out those as the years go on. So overall, I think an opportunity lost for Ferrari, but I'm excited to see how they stack up against Mercedes and Austin. I think it's going to be another interesting battle royale. Now let's talk about the last of the big three teams, if you can call it that. Red Bull probably they'd be the most disappointed out of the three, given their result, but also given their potential. I think they really lost an opportunity. Obviously, with Max on pole position, they had the potential to really control this race, and it all unraveled spectacularly for them. Obviously, Max was the architect of his own downfall, both in qualifying and in the race, I think. And Alex Albon got screwed over by strategy, and then what ended up happening with the midfield after coming out of the pits. But let's quickly talk about what was probably the most controversial thing that happened over the weekend, which was Max Verstappen's penalty in qualifying. So for those who don't know, or for those who live under a rock, so all of the top 6 drivers were out on their last run for Q3, with I think Leclerc or Albon leading the pack, with Leclerc following, and then Bottas, and then Hamilton, and then Vettel, and then Verstappen right at the end. With Verstappen obviously having set the leading time in Q3 on the first run, so he was in the perfect position to take pole. And what ended up happening is on all of their last flying laps, Albon couldn't improve on his efforts, Leclerc couldn't improve on his efforts, and then as Valtteri Bottas came around the last corner, he had a massive accident, which then effectively meant that the yellow flags came out, and that meant that everybody behind him, which then meant Hamilton, Vettel and Verstappen, had to effectively slow down and take heed of the fact that there was a stricken Mercedes in the wall. Now, Vettel quite clearly lifted, Hamilton lifted as well, and Max Verstappen just kept his foot to the floor, pedal to the metal, and actually set the fastest third sector of the race. Now, I was initially worried for Verstappen, because I think it's a very clear rule that you're not allowed to improve on your lap time when under yellow flags, and it was widely seen that the yellow flags were shown by the time that Verstappen passed Valtteri Bottas. But interestingly enough, the FIA didn't want to investigate it, since they said that the mini sector, now each of the 3 sectors are divided into little mini sectors as well, and the FIA saw that Verstappen's mini sector time over that little piece where Bottas was crashing, or where Bottas crashed, was slower than the mini sector he set when he set his initial pole lap time on his first run. So they said, no, well, Verstappen didn't improve on his mini sector time, so therefore no investigation necessary. And then Max Verstappen opened his big fat mouth in the press conference and quite arrogantly proclaimed to all of the world that he saw Bottas and that he didn't lift, therefore, no problem, and that they're all racing drivers, which means, you should be good enough to be able to avoid a car that's in the wall, which is, I guess, his opinion. But Valtteri Bottas is also a racing driver, and he very unintentionally ended up in the wall, which is something that Verstappen could have done as well, and has done in the past, incidentally, in his Toro Rosso, I think in his Toro Rosso days. So Max Verstappen being so blasé about the fact that he didn't lift during that period of yellow flags then meant that the investigation got reopened by the FIA, and he effectively got a 3-place grid penalty after having scored pole position in a very impressive fashion, and that meant that his race was immediately compromised as well. So I think this is a tough lesson to learn for Verstappen. I think the main lesson is just keep your mouth shut, especially if you're already lucky with the FIA deciding to, and quite generously deciding to not investigate what you ended up doing during that last lap in qualifying. So keep your trap shut, Max, and be a bit less blasé about not following the rules to the letter. Now, Alex Albon. Before we get to Albon, let's maybe just discuss what happened to Verstappen in the race, since I did quite pertinently say that Verstappen was the architect of his own downfall. Now, obviously, the first lap skirmish with Hamilton was a bit chaotic. I think hard racing, typical opening lap shenanigans between the two of them. Both of them got oversteer. Both of them had to cut a corner. Verstappen got off slightly worse than Hamilton did, but I think Hamilton just decided that he will not yield to Verstappen today, and that's what he ended up not doing. Verstappen obviously then got stuck behind a McLaren and behind Bottas. He passed the McLaren after a few laps, and then made a bit of an ambitious attempt to pass Bottas in the stadium section in the third sector, which then meant since there wasn't really any room for Bottas to go, he ended up clipping Verstappen's rear tyre with his front wing, which then left Verstappen with a puncture, which then meant his race was ruined. Now, he did quite an impressive laps, I think, quite an impressive stint, Verstappen now. I think over 60 laps on the hard tyres that he then put on after coming into the pits for his puncture. So that was quite good to see. I think an impressive race performance in isolation if you look at Max's race like that. But I think he'll definitely rue a couple of mistakes and a couple of irresponsible things that he did over the weekend, and hopefully he'll see this as a learning experience. Now let's move on to Alex Albon, and I think we can say that it's been an encouraging race for him. I think if his strategy worked out differently, he could have caused a few problems. He could have been on for a potential podium, but Red Bull took the gamble. They put Albon, they sent him in quite early on to come and change his tyres with the intention of undercutting Charles Leclerc, which I think would have worked out in principle if he didn't end up right behind Carlos Sainz's McLaren as he exited the pits. And obviously Sainz at that point was on very worn soft tyres, which meant that Albon effectively lost his whole undercut opportunity and then also lost a bunch of time versus Leclerc, who was coming in on the next lap for his set of tyres, which then effectively meant also with how the race developed with Vettel, Hamilton and Bottas on the one stop, meant Albon was effectively banished to finish in fifth place. I think it was 10 seconds or something behind Leclerc after that round of pit stops, which was obviously not ideal for Albon. But I think all around he maintained his streak of outscoring Verstappen during the races, and I think he will keep his seat at Red Bull next year. I'd be very surprised if they take him out. He's been delivering for the team as well as he can. Obviously his accident in FP2 wasn't ideal, or in FP1, but I think he did a good job, and he's turning out to be the solid performer that Red Bull wants, and that he maximizes his situations in the race, which I think is exactly what they need. Okay, let's briefly talk about the midfield. Didn't want to spend too much time, given that not too much happened, except absolute chaos with the tyres. But I think, and as I mentioned or alluded to in the intro of this episode, we just need to ask ourselves, what the hell happened to Carlos Sainz? Because he was running in fourth at a stage ahead of Hamilton, doing a very good job on the soft tyres in that opening stint, really extending the life and of those tyres. And then they put him on the hard tyres, and then he just absolutely disappeared. Like, it was uncanny. I was watching the race, sort of following what was going on up front, looked up 1 second, Sainz was in 7th or 8th. The next, he was down in 14th, 15th, sort of floundering on the hard tyres. And he did come out and say that something about how the hard tyres worked with their car, it didn't work out, and they need to go and analyze. But it was like watching a Haas. It was like watching Kevin Magnussen in his Haas at Spa, just every lap getting overtaken by another car, just absolutely a sitting duck, which I think was an interesting experience for the McLaren team, who had been so strong in all of the races up until this point. But I think definitely a once-off for them after a very strong showing, qualifying once again for McLaren. Definitely now, I think, moved themselves out of that best of the rest category and now in a whole category of their own, I think. So very encouraging for McLaren, and I really, really hope, don't know how possible it can be, but if they can somehow find half a second between this season and next season, if they can mix it with Red Bull and the top teams, it'll be amazing to see. Really, really amazing to see. Now, Carlos's teammate, poor Lando Norris, what another very unlucky race for him. Again, performing quite well. Now, obviously, he probably would have had the same issues as Carlos Sainz had on the hard tyres, but we didn't even get a chance to see, given that when Lando came in for his pit stop, one of his tyres wasn't put on properly, and then he drove right up until the end of the pit lane, then realised, and then stopped, and then had to push him all the way back to his pit box, fitted the tyres properly, and then by that time he was 2 laps down and his race was effectively ruined. So pity for Lando, pity for McLaren, but I'm sure they'll be back stronger. I think in terms of some of the other standout performances in the midfield, we must definitely applaud Sergio Perez for racing points. I mean, it was his home Grand Prix. All of the pressure was on him. He finished best of the race, 7th place. What a very good performance. And I think in a race or on a track where the tyres are so important and where keeping your tyres alive is such an important part of your race, you always knew Sergio Perez was going to do a good job given his capability on tyres and given his capability of keeping his tyres alive, and that turned out to be the case. He was very good in defense against Daniel Ricciardo later on in the race, so kudos to Sergio Perez, and once again, just being that consistent midfield performer, very rarely has an off race or a bad performance, so well done Sergio. I think in terms of Renault, their race was definitely redemptive after a very difficult week for them where they got disqualified from Suzuka due to the whole brake bias debacle. Now I'm not going to go into that now. If you're interested into reading exactly what the conclusion was on Renault's automatic brake bias systems that they ran during Japan, please go read up on that. It's quite a technical story, but leaving that there, obviously they lost all of those very good points at Suzuka, and then they found some issues with their oil in terms of the lubricant for their car in qualifying, which meant they had to change effectively the whole engine, well, not the whole engine, but parts of the engine in free practice 3, which then meant they had limited running going into qualifying, and then qualifying didn't go well for them at all. But given how qualifying went, ending up with a 7th and what should have been a 9th place for Nico Hülkenberg, if not for Kvyat's accident, which I'll touch on now, I think it's a good return to form for Renault, and I think they've really just had so much bad luck and so many unfortunate things happen to them. I think if they can just start stringing race weekends together, they can really start challenging McLaren, I think, for best of the rest. Now, in terms of the other midfield runners, really not much to report on. I think it's worth noting that Kvyat pulled this really stupid move on Hülkenberg just before starting the last lap, which meant that Hülkenberg's race was effectively ruined. Now, Kvyat did get a 10-second penalty for that, and I think with the way the classification works at the end, Hülkenberg did end up scoring a point in 10th. And I think the other honourable mention is just George Russell, who did well to finish ahead of one of the Haas cars. I think any Williams finishing ahead of another car on merit deserves a mention, so well done, George Russell. Okay, so that's my views on the grid in general, so let's promptly move on to the TF1 awards. The Pastor Maldonado Award for Most Dunderheaded Deed has to go to Max Verstappen's antics after qualifying. Ratting yourself out in front of the world's press out of pure arrogance and getting a penalty out of it is just playing yourself. The Lewis Hamilton #Blessed Award has to go to Charles Leclerc in qualifying. He was off the pace the whole weekend, and Valtteri Bottas' accident meant that neither Vettel or Hamilton could beat his time, then scoring a pole position purely due to Verstappen not being able to keep his mouth shut. Lastly, the Nico Hülkenberg Award for Unluckiest Driver has to go to Lando Norris. He left his pit box on 3 wheels, but drove straight into our hearts on 4 wheels. Now, luckily we have the Austin Grand Prix next week, and that track is low-key one of the best ones on the calendar, and people can fight me on it. I really think it possibly delivers the best races consistently out of any track on the grid, maybe with the exception of Austria. But I'm really excited to see the race between the teams. I'm really excited to see who's going to be the team ahead, how Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull are going to stack up against each other. So as always, we leave the race with a couple of pertinent questions. Will Albon keep his streak of outscoring Verstappen alive? Will Christian Horner finally be able to remove his head from Max Verstappen's rear end? And will Vettel continue his resurgence and put Leclerc right back in his place? As always, much to ponder. So that's it for another episode. As always, please subscribe and leave a review if you enjoyed the podcast, and feel free to chat with me on Instagram or on Twitter. So I'll be back for our recap of the US Grand Prix in Austin next week. Really looking forward to it and chatting to you all next week. Bye.